So the number 2 company on our top 50 developers list for 2015 is GungHo Online Entertainment from Japan. Everyone should know, at least, that GungHo is all about Puzzle & Dragons. So Puzzle & Dragons is, or has been for the last couple of years, the top grossing smartphone game in Japan. It could be argued it actually created the smartphone gaming market in Japan, really. Up to that point, there have been a lot of kind of browser-based games that ran on feature phones. But if you just look at the kind of the top grossing nature of Puzzle & Dragons, from 2013 into 2014 and still in 2015, it is just a phenomenon in that market, and the Japanese market is the most lucrative mobile games market in the world at the moment. Maybe China will overtake it at some point, but at the moment Japan is the place to be number 1. So for 2014, Puzzle & Dragons was the top grossing game in Japan for most of the year. At one point in the year, it was in fact taking 50% of the entire spend within the Japanese smartphone games market. So half of every yen being spent in Japan was going into that one game. I mean, it's just an absolute phenomenon in that market. It's much more dominant even than the Clash of Clans would be in the Western markets. But it has been kind of, as you expect with any number 1, comes under pressure from other kind of challengers. So for summer 2014, Puzzle & Dragons was being challenged by Puzzle RPG, but it kind of pretty much kind of managed to kind of hold its number 1 spot. And take the Puzzle RPG as the number 2 spot. So there's kind of a good bit of kind of competition for most of the year between those two games. And well, Puzzle & Dragons is massive in Japan. They have actually been quite successful outside of Japan. So even in the US, they've had 5 million downloads. Western Europe, been a few million downloads, and in the rest of Southeast Asia, in places like Taiwan and Hong Kong, that game has also done very well and been very successful. So it's not purely a Japanese kind of market. Whereas some of the Japanese games, so say like Puzzle RPG, is purely a Japanise phenomenon. So the good thing for GungHo is they've kind of proven that they've had one big success in a big market, and they can kind of spread that success around. One interesting kind of situation was at the end of 2014, GungHo did a deal with Tencent to release Puzzle & Dragons into the Chinese market for the first time. Be interesting to see how that game does, because Puzzle & Dragons has been so successful and the Chinese developers are so quick at kind of spotting success, and there's been quite a lot of games that basically use the same mechanics as Puzzle & Dragons, and some of those have been very successful. So for much of 2013 and 14, that there was some of the top grossing Chinese games have basically been versions of Puzzle & Dragons with different kind of characters and artwork. So I guess strategically, it's kind of been interesting for GungHo now in 2015 that there's kind of an argument about whether you kind of reach with these big games, whether you reach kind of a peak audience or a peak kind of revenue stream. And we've seen this with, I guess, a little bit with kind of Clash of Clans and Candy Crush. These kind of games, how big can these big games get? Certainly GungHo are pretty gung-ho about the fact they can still grow the market, because in terms of actual downloads, it's not very many. It's about 40 million downloads that Puzzle & Dragons has had globally, so obviously that's very small compared to something like Candy Crush Saga. Obviously they appeal to very different audiences. Puzzle & Dragons is fairly Japanese and fairly hardcore for most people, certainly in the West, to appeal. So what's kind of we're seeing with these kind of massive games that are very kind of lucrative is we kind of see companies looking to see how they can kind of focus that success in different areas. So actually GungHo, which is actually, I mean, mobile games in terms of headcount are actually a very small part of its business. So it owns kind of 3 or 4 development studios that make console games. So the most famous maybe is Grasshopper, but also has companies like Acquire, Game Art, people like that. So it does do console games as well as mobile games. So it's kind of looking to had some crossover success with taking Puzzle & Dragons, particularly in Japan, to the 3DS. So there's been a couple of releases of 3DS versions of Puzzle & Dragons, and they've done pretty well, okay. And equally, because it's such a big phenomenon in Japan, they actually have started to get to the level where they're having like Puzzle & Dragon theme parks and Puzzle & Dragon conventions. It's got to that kind of like Angry Birds type situation. So it's kind of interesting opportunities I think they have to kind of break out that brand. I guess not necessarily the worrying thing, but the one thing GungHo hasn't managed to do is kind of have another kind of secondary hit. So that's becoming increasingly hard to do in the market, which makes kind of Supercell with its 3 top grossing games almost unique. I mean, it's just very hard to get multiple games at that scale. And GungHo, I mean, it's released some kind of interesting games. I guess the most interesting one that was a bit more maybe focused on the Western market was Slingshot Braves, And that was, I mean, for other companies that may have been a success, but compared to Puzzle and Dragons, obviously was nothing like that experience. So the other interesting thing that GungHo is doing, because it's generating so much money now from obviously $1 billion franchise, just generates a lot of free cash. So it's starting to invest, and I guess that's the future of the company will be interesting for 2015 to see how those investments play out. So talking about China, it's taken an investment in Qcong, which is one of the big Chinese publisher developers and tool companies. So it's taken a small stake in that to give it better access to the Chinese market. And obviously we all know the Chinese market will at some point be the biggest mobile games market in the world, just purely by the fact that China is so much bigger than everywhere else in terms of population, and they love mobile phones. The other kind of, I guess, more strategic investments that GungHo has done, it's made an investment into a US company called Camcord. And Camcord is a fairly small startup, but it does the video playback of gameplay. So it's kind of like a social sharing type thing. So you can play a game and capture the gameplay video on your phone, Android or iOS, and then kind of share it in a kind of like a YouTube type approach. So that's kind of an interesting play, I guess, for companies that are looking to kind of find kind of social networks and find kind of fans of games and kind of grow audiences. And in a similar vein, but a much bigger investment, was a company called Playphone, which is a US based company that kind of ran its own social kind of a community network, some monetization stuff as well in there. So I mean, a bit like a kind of I guess a mobile phone kind of Facebook type thing, and it worked very closely with like US carriers. So it signed up with all the US carriers and some of the big carriers in Latin America and some of the big carriers in Southeast Asia as well. So what they do is they do like a white label kind of storefront, which basically means kind of other companies can brand it, but Playphone runs all the kind of infrastructure back-end stuff. And so it acts like a storefront, so like basically an equivalent of Google Play with kind of Facebook built into it. And GungHo has basically effectively bought that company. It has a majority stake in it. So that's kind of quite an interesting deal to see whether GungHo wants to do that to push its games in there, or whether GungHo wants to kind of become a bit more of an infrastructure company. And obviously the reach of Puzzle and Dragons allows it to do that in quite an interesting manner. So I guess the kind of interesting thing for 2015 for GungHo to see where it ends up on 2016's list is, you know, does it have more successful games, or does it kind of broaden its approach a little bit? Does it become a bit more rounded in terms of infrastructure and mobile gaming? So that's what we were looking for in 2015.